And when we get hurt or when someone hurts us, my heart gets hurt, my feelings get hurt, right? And when we don't respond to that correctly, it can impact so many different things.
Welcome, friends, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. I'm Matt Kaufman. Craig Stickling's with me today. Good morning, Craig.
Good morning, Matt.
Our topic today is bitterness. Craig, I want to share with you the quote that I heard that caught my attention and then it got me musing on this topic, and that was this. The quote is from Joshua Gibbs, and he says that passion is the sin of young men, while bitterness is the sin of old men. So that caught my attention, right?
Yeah, especially since I'm in the older men category now.
But then he followed it up with this, and he said, and bitterness is worse. I don't even know if that's necessarily a true statement, but it does cause us pause.
Yeah.
To really, really think. Because when we think about the big sins of this world, a lot of them are passionate sins.
Yeah.
Right? Murder, sexual infidelity, right? These sins of passion. But what the quote purports is that bitterness tends to come later in life and in some ways is more poisonous for the human.
Yeah.
And so whether it's right or wrong, we'll leave that go. But let's use that as a springboard in to this particular topic of bitterness.
Bitterness is able to permeate so many different elements of life. Our family, our spouse, our kids, our work, our church, our special interest groups, or things that we're able to get involved in, right? We're constantly in this tension of interacting with people and being let down or disappointed or things not going our way. And then how do we respond to that? And bitterness seems to be a very effective tool to be used by the enemy, right, in separating people from their rightful relationships and connections with one another.
So I just want to capture a few things. You mentioned how expansive the fingers that bitterness has in our life. And then you discussed and you mentioned even insult added to injury side, kind of the nature through which bitterness grows. So I want to capture both of those things.
Yeah.
And let's first go to that expansive. What do you mean that it touches on all of these areas?
I think it reveals the nature of our heart, right? We were created for relationship, and those things that impact relationship and the fall of man are just in sometimes our own decisions and sometimes things that we don't do well or that we don't understand in our interactions with others. Those things that are constantly separating and that tension piece that's there. And when we get hurt or when someone hurts us, the Bible uses the word offend in a sense, but really as we just basically look at that as a wounded spirit. My heart gets hurt. My feelings get hurt, right? And when we don't respond to that correctly, it can impact so many different things. It can impact, like I said, I thought I was going to be Sunday school teacher. I was hoping that would happen, and I didn't get the vote. And now what do I do with that? Or I brought home flowers for my wife, or I was like, oh, I'm so excited. We're going to go out to supper, and she had a bad day, and we're not going. And then I go and pout, and I can step back from that. Or one of my kids, I gave them some great advice, and they're doing that complete opposite. And how do I respond to that, right? We're constantly engaged in being able to be hurt or to be offended, to be pulled off what we were hoping for some way.
You know what you mentioned, and not dealt with that correctly. You mentioned if we're hurt and not dealt with it correctly. So you've even given a hint to some remedy of bitterness, and that is prevention. There is a prevention element to bitterness, which then goes on to say that bitterness tends to grow. Is that a fair statement to say? Minor events stacked up on top of each other become very significant.
Yeah. God already knew this. He already knew this was going to be a piece of our lives that we were going to have to engage even as disciples. And he gave us the word to wash and to reflect us. And we think of that verse in Hebrews 12, and it says, looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest, and here that gets into that growth part, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble us, and thereby many be defiled. So what starts small can grow, but then look at the impact.
There's that expansiveness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Not just us, but then those around us it impacts.
It requires a person with age to have this insult added to injury, compacted, unhealed wounds
Oh, yeah.
to become what bitterness is,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, and getting back to that quote, that bitterness can almost take on this veil of invisibility in a sense, right? A passion of murder, right? At the end of that moment, we see a body. It's there.
Yeah.
Bitterness becomes a little bit more under the surface.
Yeah. It's under the surface, yet defiles much. And I want you to speak a little bit of what is the manifest, what is the fruit of bitterness? It does have a root, which means it probably has a fruit,
Yeah.
right?
I like a model that I learned a long time ago that's really been helpful for me that looks at the progression, that fruit of bitterness. So it starts off with the woundedness, right? I get hurt or I get offended in some way, and I don't deal with that correctly and responsibly. So then my response next is, okay, I now have this root. The seed has been planted. This root is starting to grow. So what is some fruit of that? I think the progression that I've appreciated being able to think about is that thing goes into anger. And I start to just see them. It's not a quick flash anger, but it is a seething below the ground. It just kind of keeps there behind the scene. Festering is a great word, right?
Yeah.
And then that anger, right, that produces then an insubordination, a stubbornness, right? Okay, now I'm like that calf and my hooves are dug in and no one is going to make me move. And I get passive aggressive and I'm just not going to be teachable. I'm going to start justifying myself. I'm going to start removing my relationships with other people in a justification sense. And then that moves into the final fruit, which is the most damaging, is then rebellion, right? I don't care about anyone. I don't care what anyone thinks. I'm doing my own thing. And you see that progression coming from that brute.
Wow.
And what that produces is just so destructive. Defiling, I like how that works. Thereby many be defiled.
As you mentioned there, one of the fruit that caught my attention was that inability to be taught.
Yeah.
And then when we close ourselves off from information, from teaching, from correction, that is a dangerous place.
Yeah. The movement into that stubbornness, sometimes rebelliousness, sometimes to the person that is hurt, they're in self-protection mode. They're like, hey, I have to build these walls. I am so tired of being hurt. I have to build walls to protect. And what's interesting, yeah, we can build walls to maybe keep out hurts, but sometimes we build walls so well we keep ourselves locked in.
Yeah. And do you think also sometimes, Craig, that there is a level of comfort with the bitter narrative that we run in our head? For example, if I have been wronged, I can run that script in my head and I can soothe myself by that negative script, right? Which maintains the bitterness in my life. And it almost becomes a familiar, safe place.
Right. And that does become our comfort. It does become our go-to, doesn't it?
Yeah. So we're going to get to the prevention part because that's, I think, a really beautiful thing. But let's talk about the cure. There is hope for the bitterness, the roots of bitterness in our life. What does it look like for a person to move from a bitter place to one that's not bitter?
Great question, Matt. I remember back when my mom and dad got divorced, and I was 17 when that happened, and I see now as I look back, my mom had gotten wounded, she had gotten hurt, and she went underground with that root, right? And then when it finally started to come out and things were started to be, hey, you know what, maybe we could get some help, she was done. She had built those walls, and it was so hurtful to see that piece of her being removed from that isolation, right? And so looking back to your question, all right, how do we move forward? What are we able to do? I think the number one thing is that we really need to just be locked into the principles of dark and light. God loves light, bring to light. Satan loves dark. And then Satan also loves isolation. God loves community, right? So how do we grow? How do we connect with people that we're able to be open with someone? I think where does it start is having someone that we're able to be open with.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Craig. And to that pain, I'm incredibly sorry. And while this is not about your mom or that situation, you've just really elevated some really critical elements. And the one element is that a bitter person tends to silo themselves.
Yeah.
But your suggestion is part of that has got to be in the community.
Yeah.
The community of light.
Yeah.
That can challenge and bring light to that situation.
Yeah. So very much so. And this is where Boy, this is where it gets so vital and also so difficult, because where would we go in the midst of our hurt and our pain and our struggle with things that aren't going well? We would think we would go to our church family, right?
Yeah.
And yet there's this dynamic of shame of, well, church is where we go when we just are everything, because everything goes well when you're a Christian, right?
Yeah.
And good Christians, everything always goes well. So now if I come to this church family and I acknowledge that I'm really hurting with something that is really messy, I have a choice to make, and I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can be open, because that then it rips the facade away, and I don't know if I can do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how I'll be accepted.
Because there's so much vulnerability required.
Depth of that, isn't that?
And that vulnerability is really the capacity of exposure, right? How much exposure is going to be required when we get to these deep levels of bitterness.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about some things that are very, very personal.
Yeah.
And some things that are quite a lot to unpack if we're talking about time over time over time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Where things are not cared for and incidences. And so you're suggesting there is an opening of that, a sharing of that is quite needed
Yeah.
in order to penetrate that fortress of bitterness.
Right, right. And you step back and you look at the definition of mercy right now, looking just from a church body lens, and how do we help strengthen, grow one another, be on the lookout for the weeds of bitterness and to recognize that. But mercy recognizes that there's a need on one end, and then there's also someone on the other end who is able to meet and fulfill that need.
Yeah.
And the beauty of the church body to be able to step into that, recognizing how gossip and those who aren't confidential and what someone shares, and how quick that can just destroy a fabric of being vulnerable in a church.
So you just perceived my next question, and that is, give us instruction, Craig, to receive bitterness out of another person.
Yeah.
What does it look like to be on the other side of things and help draw the salve of that poison out?
Well, you mentioned the old man thing right here. And so there's a beauty of that in the church, right? There's that intergenerational beauty and growth, and being able to recognize, you know what, there might be someone in that next age span above or below that's in a phase of life that I've already been through. Or if I'm there, I'm able to look back and say, oh, I remember what it was like as a young family in their 30s or 20s, or even as a young, single person at college or school. But we're able to look back at that, and we're able to reach into that. So I think really to have a heart of awareness, to be willing to see, to be willing to look, to be willing to reflect where I've been, and then to be able to look and see, in my church family, where are those that are there? I want to be able to have eyes to see on a day what Christ sees.
I really like that. I just had the opportunity not too long ago to take my 11-year-old Sunday school boys out to camp. And one of the reflections that I had was at what a beautiful age they are. At 11, there's a sense of innocence.
Yeah.
And it was really good for me, a jaded adult who sees things through a slant. Perhaps they're the healthy one, right?
Yeah.
And I'm in need of them. Right?
Yeah.
And I say that more as a metaphor to this concept of what value can be brought when we mix intergenerationally.
Yeah, yeah. I think the beauty of following up, like you said, so what are some things that, that we're able to do to help support someone who is struggling here? As I said, to be able to look, right? That's the first step. Then to be able to be willing to engage, to be willing to sit and to connect, or just to say, hey, let's have coffee, or can I do a phone call, or I'll find that stool next to you at the lunch table, and to be able to sit and connect for a bit.
Yeah.
And to be willing to go, maybe reflect first, but to be willing to ask, how are you doing? How are you really doing? Right?
I think another element, Craig, is you need to be willing to endure the hardness of what that person is going to share. And sometimes the hard manner through which they're going to share it.
Yeah.
Because when we share the bitterness in our life, it's not often with a smile, and sometimes it's with a snip.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to receive that and recognize that the bitterness is talking right now.
Yeah. Hurt people.
Yeah.
And you might be the person that asks, and you might be the person that gets unloaded on.
Yeah.
But to recognize, no, wait a second, I'm not going to take this personal right now. My job is to bear that person's burden, right? And so bear one another's burdens. And so I'm going to step into that role just as, okay, you got one and I got the other, and we lift together. I'm going to help you hold this, right? And I think one of our challenges that we get is that we think we have to fix that, what they share. We think we have to go into, all right, I've got something somewhere that says, oh, hey, let me give you the solution to this. Let me fix this right now.
Yeah.
And to recognize that a hurt person right at that moment, they're not looking for solutions. They're just looking, can I trust you with my hurt?
Yeah.
And just to listen and to bear. Be willing.
Probably be slow to correct it.
Yeah. Yeah. There'll be time for that.
Yeah.
There'll be a time for that. But at that time, that I don't need to be in, oh, hey, I can fix your problem in 3 easy steps. Boom, you got a piece of paper? Let's write them down. I got them for you.
Because again, we're talking about decades built on top of each other. A few words is not going to fix this.
Yeah.
But what that person is doing is receiving that person who is bound in bitterness.
And this is where I'm going to cut in on our conversation for today. We've heard from Craig on the effects of bitterness and how the community is important to receive such individuals and the help and health that we can provide. But when we come back, Craig is going to talk to the embittered. Out of his clinical experience as well as personal life, Craig's going to shine light on a roadmap to health. I hope you can join us then.